In the spring of 1943, somewhere over the vast Pacific Ocean, a Japanese naval commander watched in horror as what appeared to be a conventional American medium bomber transformed into something entirely different. The B-25 Mitchell that approached his convoy wasn't dropping bombs from altitude like every other bomber he'd encountered. Instead, it was screaming toward his ships at wave-top level, its nose bristling with 850 caliber machine guns that unleashed a devastating storm of lead. In that moment, the commander realized that the Americans had fundamentally changed the rules of naval warfare, and his destroyer would become the first of hundreds of Japanese vessels to learn this harsh lesson. The story begins not in some Pentagon planning room, but in the workshops and hangars of the 5th Air Force in Australia and New Guinea, where American ingenuity met desperate necessity. Traditional bombing tactics against Japanese shipping had proven frustratingly ineffective. High-altitude bombing was too inaccurate against moving targets, and the Japanese Zero fighters made conventional approaches deadly for American crews. Lieutenant Colonel Paul "Pappy" Gunn, a former airline pilot turned military innovator, looked at the B-25 Mitchell and saw not just a medium bomber, but a platform for something entirely new. Working with his maintenance crews in makeshift workshops under the scorching Pacific sun, Gunn began what would become one of the war's most successful field modifications. They removed the standard bombardier's position from the B-25's nose and replaced it with a solid metal structure mounting 4 additional 50 caliber machine guns. Combined with the 4 existing guns in wing positions, this created an unprecedented concentration of forward-firing firepower. The modification wasn't pretty, but it didn't need to be. It needed to destroy Japanese ships, and that's exactly what it would do. The first test of this new weapon came during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943. Japanese Admiral Masatomi Kimura was leading a convoy of 8 destroyers and 8 transports, carrying 7,000 troops to reinforce New Guinea. The convoy represented Japan's determination to hold their Pacific conquests, but they had no idea what awaited them in the waters ahead. American intelligence had detected the convoy, and General George Kenney had his modified B-25s ready for their combat debut. On March 2, 1943, the weather cleared over the Bismarck Sea, and Kenney's pilots took off for what would become known as the most devastating anti-shipping attack of the Pacific War. The modified B-25s approached at masthead height, their engines roaring as they skimmed just feet above the waves. Japanese sailors had faced American bombers before, but nothing had prepared them for what they witnessed that day. The lead B-25 opened fire at point-blank range, its 8 machine guns creating a wall of bullets that swept across the deck of a Japanese destroyer like a deadly broom. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The concentrated firepower of 8 50 caliber machine guns, each firing 600 rounds per minute, created what pilots later described as a buzzsaw of destruction. The bullets didn't just damage equipment. They shredded everything in their path. Japanese sailors were cut down at their battle stations, gun crews were decimated before they could return fire, and the superstructure of warships was literally torn apart by the sustained assault. What made it even more devastating was that the B-25s weren't finished after their strafing runs. They would circle back and attack again and again until their ammunition was exhausted. The Japanese had faced many weapons during the war, but the sight of these American bombers turned gunships was something entirely new and terrifying. Traditional naval doctrine called for ships to maneuver and fight back against attacking aircraft. But how do you fight back against 8 machine guns, firing simultaneously from an aircraft that approaches so low it's almost touching the water? Japanese anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress low enough to engage effectively, and by the time they could react, the American aircraft had already made their devastating pass and were climbing away. During the 3-day battle, the modified B-25s, working alongside Australian bow fighters and conventional bombers, achieved results that stunned both sides. Of the 16 ships in the Japanese convoy, only 4 destroyers limped back to their base. All 8 transports were sunk or so heavily damaged they had to be abandoned. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors lost their lives, and the reinforcement mission to New Guinea was a complete failure. The victory was so complete that it effectively ended Japanese attempts to reinforce their positions in New Guinea using surface ships. But the impact went far beyond this single battle. News of the B-25 gunship's effectiveness spread throughout the Pacific theater, and soon modification kits were being developed to convert more bombers into these ship-killing machines. The standard B-25J would eventually come from the factory, with 8 nose-mounted machine guns as standard equipment. American pilots began to refer to their aircraft as shipbusters, and for good reason. These modified bombers would go on to sink or damage hundreds of Japanese vessels throughout the rest of the Pacific War. The psychological impact on the Japanese Navy was equally devastating. Ship captains, who had once felt relatively secure against air attack, now faced the prospect of aircraft that could approach at wave level and deliver firepower equivalent to a light cruiser's broadside. Japanese convoy commanders began requesting fighter escorts that they couldn't spare, and shipping routes that had once been considered safe became death traps. The modified B-25s hadn't just sunk ships. They had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. What made this innovation particularly American was how it emerged not from high-level strategic planning, but from the practical problem-solving of men in the field. Pappy Gunn and his mechanics hadn't asked permission from headquarters to modify their aircraft. They had seen a problem and found a solution. This spirit of innovation, combined with American industrial capacity to mass-produce the modifications, gave the United States a weapon that the Japanese simply couldn't counter effectively. The 8-gun nose of the B-25 represented more than just additional firepower. It symbolized American adaptability and ingenuity in the face of adversity. When conventional tactics weren't working, American forces didn't simply accept the status quo. They experimented, they innovated, and they found new ways to bring the fight to the enemy. The Japanese military, with its rigid adherence to established doctrine, struggled to adapt to this kind of tactical innovation. By the war's end, the B-25 gunship had become one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific. Japanese survivors spoke of the terror they felt when they saw the distinctive twin-engine silhouette approaching at wave level, knowing that within seconds their ship would be raked by a storm of machine gun fire that few vessels could survive. The modification that began in a makeshift workshop in Australia had evolved into a weapon system that helped tip the balance of the Pacific War in America's favor. Today, when we look back at the innovations of World War II, it's easy to focus on the famous weapons and famous battles. But sometimes, the most important developments happened in small workshops where determined men refused to accept that there wasn't a better way to fight. The 8-gun nose of the B-25 Mitchell stands as a testament to American ingenuity and the power of innovation in warfare. It reminds us that in the darkest hours of conflict, ordinary people can find extraordinary solutions that change the course of history.